if we enable science and innovation capacity building in those countries so that they can undertake local research and development, that they can adapt technologies that are transferred to them to their local needs, and if we continue to diffuse scientific knowledge and transfer technologies. Given all these contributions that I've outlined, sorry, we'll go back. I hope it becomes obvious then that we do want science and technology to be governed in a way that's compatible with sustainable development. And I think the easiest way to illustrate this is to look at sort of a demonstration of how neglecting the sustainable development approach is affecting current and future outcomes of science and technology at present. So if you have science and technology outside of a sustainable development approach, they will still provide benefits, that's obvious. We do get benefits from science and technology, but meeting the needs of developing countries is problematic. And again, this goes back to the sort of market incentives are lacking for meeting those particular needs. What's also lacking is consideration of long-term impacts and of equity in policy making. And there's a continued concentration of research and development in developed countries and on commercial interests. At the moment, it is improving that situation. It's got to the stage, I think, the most recent figures of UNESCO, so that research and development is about 75% in the developed world and 25% in the developing world, which, however, is completely in disproportion to the population sizes. And also, when you come to the key areas of research and development, like health research and development and agricultural research and development, this shifts back to being 95, 97% in the developed world. There's also, again, because of markets, there's this lack of incentives for adapting technologies to the needs of the poor. It's all very well to be transferring technology to them, but if it's not made so that it's actually applicable to the local context, it's not of much use. And of course, the key example of that are the provision of computers to areas where there is no electricity supply. So this is, again, just a conclusion that I would draw, that if you've got a situation, which we do have at the moment, which leaves the application of science and technology largely dependent on market forces, this will value the interests of the rich more than the poor, and it's likely to further entrench poverty and inequity and unsustainable patterns of economic growth. And therefore, not only is it desirable that science and technology should be governed in a sustainable development approach, I'd say there's also a moral imperative to do so. So the second question I'm going to run through is, what would compatible governance incorporate? So we can start with some principles. Here I want to emphasize the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So this basically states that all states, all countries have a responsibility for making the necessary changes to move to a sustainable development approach. But the responsibilities for past and present unsustainable consumptions fall principally on the developed countries. The reason I particularly pick this out is that there are other things that then follow from this principle. But firstly, I would add that and again, this comes outside what's said in the international documents, but I would say that these states also have a greater responsibility because they hold the preponderance of power in international institutions. So alongside other factors, this means that they have the ability to make or block key changes. So in addition to this principle of common but differentiated responsibility, it's recognized that developing countries are not all in the position to be able to make changes in order to be developed sustainably without further assistance from outside. So that might be technical assistance, but it may just simply be financial resources, it may be institutional assistance. And again, this is something that has been committed to not only in the international documents on sustainable development, but in a number of supposedly legally binding international treaties. States commit again and again to technology transfer, to additional financial resources, and it's a key area in which progress has simply not been made. Now this idea of providing additional resource flows is particularly emphasized when it comes to science and technology, and come across the need for science and technology capacity building. Now this is key because as we keep moving forward and keep developing science and technology, the knowledge gaps are actually growing between countries. And knowledge has become the key source of development and also of economic power. So here, and again, this is our common future, so this is nearly 25 years ago. There are statements being made that procedures and policies that influence these exchanges must stimulate innovation and they must ensure ready and widespread access to environmentally sound technologies. Now, this doesn't just go back 25 years, this goes back to the Stockholm Declaration of 1972. Even at this point, it's been recognised that scientific research and development are key if we're going to deal with environmental problems and key to development. Again, it was recognised there that this includes open dissemination of scientific knowledge and information, transfer of technology and transfer of know-how. So I would summarise where I think the principles should be going. So the governance of science and technology, I think, should be guided by the urgent need to promote human development. It needs to recognise the fundamental interdependence of humanity. It needs to recognise a connected requirement to move beyond the traditional conceptions of national interest. These are very narrowly conceived, and they also include this pursuit of short-term economic gain. And when I talk about short-term and long-term, I like to reflect back to the intellectual property system, which gives rights for up to 20 years. I still see that as a short-term thing. It's about short-term economic advantage. I think long-term, we need to be looking 30, 50 onwards. And indeed, instead of this, they need to shape their interest around these long-term goals of the well-being of humanity and sustainability of the environment. But in terms of content, this then would include such as, again, the significant transfer of technology, but I would add to that the caveat this must be on fair terms. It must be in ways that enable local adaptation. I noted yesterday there was some complaint that once technology had been transferred, it was being disseminated within the country, and that was a bad thing. It wasn't giving gains back. For me, that's a good thing. You don't want to just transfer it once and it be used once. You want to disseminate it properly. And it also, again, needs to be done in ways that enable local adaptation to take place. Secondly, there does need to be additional financial and technical support for building endogenous, that's local research and development capacity. We need to promote this shift in concentration from research and development from the private interests. This includes supervision of extra market incentives, and as has also been mentioned repeatedly through this conference, we need an increase in public funding in key areas such as health and agriculture. There needs to be a reduction of trade distortions and fundamental changes to the trading system and the terms of trade. And not surprisingly, again, given the Institute's interests, we do need to promote open dissemination of scientific knowledge and information, and this includes its provision in diverse languages. So there are several international initiatives now that provide open access to scientific journals, but these are still predominantly written in English and aren't then of particular use in local contexts. Furthermore, compatible governance will include changes to the intellectual property system, including improving access to knowledge and the end products of innovation, strengthening the flexibilities simply so that there are flexibilities already built in, which would be extremely useful if developing countries were allowed or enabled to use them rather than pressured into taking on these TRIPS plus agreements. I would think we do need to develop alternative protection systems for innovations. Again, we can separate off, and I'm not sure where we draw the boundaries exactly, but innovations that are meeting key welfare goals for humanity should be treated in a different way to, say, cosmetics. Further to this, we need to remove the barriers to entry in key industries, particularly thinking of the pharmaceutical industry. But this connects to the intellectual property system. It's extremely costly and it requires a great deal of expertise to navigate. So that also prevents the entry of small companies. And again, this is a theme that's running across the conference. Individual changes need to be made to our consumption and production patterns. And again, I'm not mentioning anything particularly radical here. These are all things that have been recognised within the international agreements. So, what does this require? Again, these are the suggestions that have come from the international documents directly. Again, you can see, like I say, I'm not saying anything really different to them. They want technology transfer, increased flows of knowledge, exchange of scientific information, capacity building for national research and development, institutional capacity building, adaptation of technologies, regulatory assistance, and market interventions and changes to the terms of trade. So what does this require? Quite simply, it requires shifts in national attitudes, policies, and actions. It requires these changes to the international system, particularly in the trade and intellectual property regimes, to affect distribution of and access to key knowledge, goods, and services. And it requires changes in individual behaviour. I just want to pick up on a second quote here. This is from the 2010, so the most recent report from the UN Secretary General on progress with the Millennium Development Goals. Here he's calling for a new sustainable development paradigm. I would actually disagree. We already have the paradigm there, we're just not making use of it. But again, he's calling for key sectors, and by which he particularly means developed states, to come to understand the nature and gravity of the challenge and seize the opportunity to revise their agendas. I'll come back to this report a bit later on. So, how does the current management of science and innovation fit into this? It's based essentially on a competitive and short-term approach, which is not compatible with sustainable development. The existing systems, so like I said, the trading system, but general international systems, serve to entrench power relations that already exist. They've been designed in a particular way to serve particular interests of the powerful states, and like I mentioned before, the powerful states also are able to manipulate these processes much more than poorer states are able to. They provide disproportionate benefits to a minority of states, and they contribute to development failures. So these are some of the important dynamics in current science and innovation management. This continued concentration of research and development in developed nations, which contributes to the deep and persistent knowledge divides which are increasing. It shifts away from public funding in key public good areas such as agricultural research, which causes, and I'm not necessarily trying to blame industry for pursuing market goals, it's simply a natural sort of process. If you restrict public funding, then research increasingly becomes dominated by commercial interests. And we have an intellectual property system that's linking innovation to market incentives, and thus obstructs access to knowledge and products. So in summary, this represents failures to fulfill commitments. These are another couple of reports from UN Secretary Generals. So it's not that this is not recognised. I think this is a particular thing to emphasise, is that these are not just matters of nice wording. These are matters of life and death. So a bit more to explain why this is happening, and I go back to this thing about the conceptions of interests. So the current conception of interests is that we do need to compete with each other, that it's all about gaining economic growth because this will give us power, it gives you political power, and we need to compete and we need to keep growing. This quote picks up on this. So basically, states are incentivized within the political system to keep pursuing political and economic power and to ignore long-term interests, which I've then come up with this sort of diagram which to me explains what's going on within the international system and what sort of rebalancing needs to take place.